Well, welcome to the Triclinium, a podcast named after the three-sided table used in the Lord's Supper, where you're invited to join the three of us as we think through matters of Christian faith, practice, and community. My name is Jacob Hawley, and I'm here with my co-hosts, as always, Eric Berger and Nate Lead. And today we will be discussing communion. So we're gonna chat, and we've been talking about different things having to do with worship over the past couple of weeks. We've talked about what worship is, what kinds of music we think are important, what the themes of a worship service are. We've also talked about whether or not we should use images in our worship, and so this is just going to be kind of a continuation of the theme, and we're going to talk about what communion is and what's happening in communion when we take it together. So I will go ahead and throw it over to Nate. Nate, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good. Yeah, excited to talk about communion, and right after this, my wife and I are going to go see Dune Part 2. So that's gonna date this episode. We're not seeing it on opening weekend, so you don't know exactly when we're recording this. Haha. Yeah, we're really excited for that, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So
you were gonna see it on opening weekend, weren't you?
I was gonna see it the day it dropped. Like, it's official opening day, but they did a bunch of like fan screenings beforehand. So, but yeah, I was gonna see it on opening day.
This just harkens back to Nate's terrible birthday, the worst birthday that maybe has ever been had by anybody.
Well, I don't want to sound like
so
I'm suffering
horrible.
over here. I'm still happy in my life, but yeah, my birthday was not the best.
I'm glad you can laugh about it.
Yeah.
It felt like an episode of a cartoon show, how horribly wrong things went that day for you.
Yeah, it was like the sad episode of like SpongeBob or something. It's like,
yeah,
man,
exactly.
This can get like, why is it not fun?
Yeah, why you just SpongeBob's just crying for 15 minutes straight.
Yeah.
That's my favorite episode of SpongeBob. So well, good. I'm glad you get to go see Dune. I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen Dune 1, so I'm like behind
I've only
on
seen
culture,
part
I
of
guess.
Dune 1, and I haven't read the book, so I don't really get it.
Yeah. My lead
That's fine,
pastor
you guys.
said
That's
that
fine, whatever.
like the soundtrack. One of the pastors at my church was saying that the soundtrack is just awesome, like legendary for this. And my lead pastor said it sounded like the vacuum was going the whole time. Like, it was just, the bass was too loud, and it just sounds like a vacuum. And I
Is
thought
there
that was
like
hilarious.
some sort of?
So.
Is it written by like a Christian author or something? Because I've seen people like freaking out, like making videos about like typologies of Christ and Dune and stuff like that. Or I haven't watched any of them, but.
No.
I mean, that just sounds like Christian behavior, is like showing how everything is actually Christian if you look deep enough, and it's like, maybe just settle down a little bit.
Well, no. So Frank Herbert, I don't believe he was Christian. I read a little bit into him. I read a little bit of his synopsis. I mean,
Frank Herbert's a great name.
Yes, definitely. But no, he wrote it back in the 50s and 60s, so, I mean, maybe, but that was also when Christianity was a lot more ingrained.
Yeah, everyone was Christian.
Yeah, it was a lot more ingrained in
whether you wanted to be or not.
So I think maybe some of those, like, well, obviously the story has a messianic prophecy of saving people groups, so I'm sure that there are some hyperlinks back to Christ in that story of redemption.
Yeah.
But Frank Herbert was very clear, and since you guys don't care about the story, I can tell you, but when he wrote the first book of Dune, it got turned down like 23 times or 27 times or whatever by publishers, and then it finally got picked up, and then it was a hit. Everybody loved reading it. It was an awesome story, but Frank was so concerned that people were making the main character Paul to be like this ultra hero or whatever, and so he wrote the second book, in which he like made Paul a complete like villain or anti-hero. So it's a very interesting character arc. It's not one that you're going to see very common. It's basically like if Frodo all of a sudden turned into like Sauron, like, apparently. I haven't read the second book, but it's like it's a crazy arc, and Frank Herbert was like, no, don't think of him as a hero, don't do that. So it was like, so he basically, you know, he wanted to change people's perception of his hero. So it's really interesting. Honestly, can't think of a story that's done that before. You know, there's usually always good and bad, but to see your main character that is good in the first book turn into the bad guy, or a bad archetype. So
I could throw in one example: Star Wars.
Oh yeah, of Anakin.
Or Annie.
Yeah.
But that was like written back into it, arguably. So
yeah, and we already knew his arc before the prequels, so
right. Yeah,
we knew that he turned good at the end of Return of the Jedi.
It's fascinating, though, that this book has gained such traction, especially now, and like now that we're making like movies about it, because that does signal the postmodern change from, you know, there is a defined good and evil in and you know, like you can clearly articulate who is on the right and wrong side, back to the kind of postmodern place we're in now, where it's like, actually we're kind of suspicious that there is good and evil, and anyone that we think is good, we're kind of now like, maybe they had some, you know, there's the unearthing of their past, or of the way that they got to the power in the first place, or you know, of the decisions no one else knows about. So that's, you know, it's maybe that's partly because the water temperature has changed, that book has now, you know, gained such crazy traction. Though it sounds like even back in the day it was popular, so it's fascinating.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting, and you know, I think that well, for one, in the current climate of Hollywood, original stories are few and far between.
For sure.
So when they're looking for intellectual properties to remake, like we just saw this with the Avatar: The Last Airbender remake, like that's a remake. They just remade the Percy Jackson series on Disney Plus
again.
Like, so Dune was inevitable eventually, when a popular sci-fi novel.
You're
it would probably have gotten a movie at any point, but well, it got a movie back in the 80s or 90s, but it was terrible. It was really bad, because you can imagine trying to bring to life like all these different sci-fi worlds back then. Was a huge task, and Star Wars managed it, but Dune was not so lucky. But you know, you could say the same about like the sequel Star Wars movies. Like, we have the technology to make that happen, but those were bad movies. But Dune apparently is a great movie. So,
all right, I'm gonna get like the hell dropped down on me for saying this, but I think I am of the opinion that the reason that people love Star Wars was because it made them excited based on the technology that they had in their day. But I think that like there's a growing population now that in our generation that go back and watch the originals and go, this is not good. Like, this is very bad. Like, all of this is like, you know, the very cheesy effects, and you know, obviously the story is pretty robust, right? Like, that's stuck, I think, the test of time. But I think sometimes the acting and the effects is not, you know, up to par. But I think there's the nostalgia element that kept it alive for a lot. And so for me, like, I grew up when the prequels were being released, and I still have a hard time stomaching the opinion that the prequels are bad, right? Like, I grew up with these characters, right? Like, this is, you know, this is the Star Wars that mattered to me. If I had the option between Attack of the Clones, you know, and watching A New Hope, I was gonna watch Attack of the Clones 9 times out of 10, right? Because it had cool battles and all that.
Yeah,
right?
I love the prequels. That was kind of like, I don't think it was the first Star Wars movie I watched, but it was definitely like the first one I understood more. So you know, like I don't know why, but
you learn what a Senate is. I mean, like, there's
a
lot of
democracy.
Learning. yeah. Think about like I think there's no disputing though that Phantom Menace is just a terrible movie no matter what. Like, that was always the last watched one for me. I was like, oh, so
but Darth
boring.
Maul was the coolest villain.
Oh, dude, they needed to do more with him. Okay, we're going way off track. Eric, how are you?
Anyway, sorry. I could talk about this all the time.
No, I know. This is great.
I'm doing great. As you guys are doing this, I'm like scrolling through as many resources as I can on the Lord's Supper.
Trying to get ready
Eric
for
is actually prepping for this podcast.
Get ready to
I
rumble.
woke up late today, so
Yeah.
my bad, y'all. But I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm excited to talk about this. I feel like I still have a long ways to go on my understanding of both the sacraments, but I think this could be a fruitful, helpful conversation.
Right, because that's what we're talking about today. Let's just remind everybody after that crazy diatribe on sci-fi shows and story arcs. We're going to talk about communion today, so completely unrelated. Well, cool. Yeah, me too. So let's go ahead and begin then. So why don't we start this way? Like, let's just paint our backgrounds a little bit on this conversation because I think that will help. Let's start with Nate. Nate, what have the churches in the past, like, what have you gathered from what they see communion as? Like, what are the forms? How is it served? What kinds of passages do you hear going with it? What kind of advice do you hear going with it? Like, paint a picture of where you come from and, like, what your church back home used to, say about communion.
Yeah. Man, that's good. I'm trying to bring to my memory. I feel like communion. Well, so the church that I went to growing up and through high school and a little bit through college was Nazarene background, and so if that informs anybody as to what kind of church background I have.
So grape juice.
Yes. Yeah. So I feel like communion was done once a month. I don't know. Communion was always kind of like just that extra. It was like the cherry on top of whatever sermon was happening that day. It didn't feel like communion ever really got explained. Outside of like 1 Corinthians 11.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the passage that is always read, for communion, or the few verses in 1 Corinthians 11. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I grew up just like this is what we do. Like communion is shown, or communion is a practice that we do to remind ourselves of Christ's Last Supper with the disciples, where he teaches them that his body is the bread and his blood is the wine, and on just that. Oh man, I'm really messing up. I'm really just trying to think it through.
No, you're fine. It's like it's hard sometimes, I think, to reach back into our memories and try to. Because I think, especially at that age, everything you're experiencing is so guttural. It's not really happening at a level of like articulation, right? It's you're not thinking about how to talk about this with other people. You're just ingesting it, right? And so I think that's actually. That may be, in a roundabout way, part of the appeal of communion in a church that's almost a little bit tired of the intellectualism, right? Like in a church age that's tired of being talked to about what the right things to think are, and still having so little experience with the Holy Spirit and having so little transformation. Like I think. There's a reconnection to the body that happens in communion that is really helpful. But I think part of it is like we're trembling, or we're not trembling. We're stumbling on a mystery here, and I think it's important to recognize that. So,
yeah, exactly. And I think just to like the simplest way that I can say it is like communion was a practice that we did in church. Routinely, so like once a month, and it was done just to remember Christ's sacrifice and the promises that he made to the disciples during the Last Supper. So, like the 1 Corinthians 11:24, do this in remembrance of me. How Christ says that, whenever you drink the the
Yeah.
wine. When you drink the blood and when you eat the bread, do this in remembrance of me.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it was done for. You know, it's like, hey, let's all remember Christ's sacrifice, and that when we take part, or when we eat the bread and drink the wine in air quotes,
right.
that we're connected to this in a way, and we remember that we're brought into, or we're a part of Christ's sacrifice in a way. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah, was it something that was done communally? Like, do you all wait to take it together, or do you take your little thing and then you go back and you sit, or is it passed around to you? Like, what was the mode of and what did it look like? Was it like a tiny little cup?
Yeah,
with a tiny little cracker?
Yeah.
Or was it?
I feel like our church went through a couple different phases. We definitely had the communicables with the plastic, like the chalice.
That's so funny. That's a great name for him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
The one side was wine and the other side was bread, or the standard cup, not standard cup, but the one cup with the peel back one layer, it's the bread, the next layer is the wine.
Right.
We definitely went through that, but I feel like we also went through a time where there was like actually like sourdough, like pieces that were broken up and put out there, and we also had gluten-free options, and we were in Oregon still, so had to have that, but which was good. You know, I make fun of it, but I think it's a good thing too.
Yeah.
No, I don't think anybody should have to break out. So just
no.
Take part in
Jesus
communion.
isn't it's not like the gluten is important for Jesus to be present.
Yeah. So yeah, we had times, or we had times where the like plate of them would get passed down to us by the ushers, and we'd pass it on. We also had times where they were like stations, or like little like just tables with them, and we would all get up out of our seat and go and get them and bring them back.
Yeah.
And then there was usually like a time for reflection. The worship team would come out and play a song, and then and some people would take communion at that time, you know, if they felt it necessary. But then the pastor would come up and then invite all of us to take communion at once.
Okay, so it was all at once.
Mostly it was communal, and
Yeah.
sometimes it was. I feel like they really went back and forth. Maybe that's why my memory is so foggy, because we really did it in like every conceivable way.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Thank you for that kind of background. Was there ever any like unpacking of like whether or not they believed that what was happening was in some way like sacred or holy, or like mysterious, or was it kind of just like, no, this is just a symbol, we just do this? And like,
yeah, I feel like in my home church back in Oregon, I feel like it was definitely more symbolic. It didn't have that kind of like reverency, that I think I kind of expect from it now. It was kind of like, hey, we invite you into this, and this is what it means, and so let's all take it, and obviously that's a simplification of what the actual service was. It was very meaningful still, but like Lauren and I were going to a church here in Dallas for a little while, and the way that they approached communion was very reverent. This church was a bit more liturgical, and what was it? There was a benediction at the end of every service. We would sing the doxology.
Oh wow.
Yeah, but for the most part, I'm pretty sure it was like non-denominational, but they liked the liturgical structure of the Sunday service. But the way that they approached communion, they passed it out and invited all of us to do it communally, but they reminded us like, hey, this is Christ's body and his blood broken and shed for you, and like this is a reminder of your salvation. This is a reminder of the sacrifice of Christ for you. Really leaning into it. But one thing that they would do before all that is they would say, hey, if this is your first time here, or if you don't really know, if you haven't trusted in Christ, or you don't have a relationship with him yet, hey, we would invite you to abstain from communion.
Sure.
And that was the first time I'd actually heard that. I was like, whoa, you can invite people to not take communion? I was like, that seems weird. Like, don't we want people to take communion? But I was like, no, it makes total sense. You know, it's like this is obviously a particular thing for people that have this relationship with Christ. You know, this means something to the point where we don't want somebody to just take it without knowing what it means. You know?
Yeah.
So that was really meaningful to me, because that was like, oh man, yeah, this is really important, and we want people to know what this means, you know.
It's good. Thank you. That's good. That gives me a lot of, like, I think, framework for understanding where you're coming from. So thank you, Nate.
Yeah.
Eric, what about you? What background did you come from as far as communion's practice?
I mean, mine's pretty similar to Nate. I grew up in a non-denominational church, and in America, I think those within more Baptistic type persuasions are probably more than likely going to view both sacraments as something more of mere symbolism and nothing more. So that's most certainly what I got growing up. I got that from church, from family, from plenty of people. So yeah, I don't hold that view now. And I actually find that view very problematic nowadays. But
okay, wow,
for a number of reasons that we can probably get into here in a minute. But that's kind of what I grew up with. That's what I suspect a lot of people in the American context have probably grown up with too, if they're coming from that particular stream.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's not much more to it. So if you want to go into your views as well, Jacob, that'd be cool.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a church that did it once a month, and it was passed around, and it was the little crackers with the cups of juice. And then I moved to a church, a Baptist church, so it was symbolicist, right? And then I moved to a church that that same like method of doing it, but the one thing that was different is that we do it every week. Every week we do communion. It's presented every week. And like, I kind of forget how uncommon that is in Baptist circles, or actually in most circles, right? Except for like the higher liturgy, right, where the Eucharist is actually, or the communion is actually the centerpiece of the Sunday service together, of the gathering. Like, I forget how uncommon that is, and so I'm at a church now that we do it every week, and we've done it every week for a very, very long time. And it's one of those things that, like, I couldn't give you a super reasoned defense of why I think we should be doing it every week. I could give you some, like, philosophical reasons of why. Some pragmatic reasons why. But it's one of those things where, like, if we stop doing that, I'm going to raise a fuss, because I really think we should keep doing it. Like, it matters a lot.
Yeah, there's no scriptural proof text that's going to tell you that you should do it every week. So, no. Yeah, but pragmatically speaking, I think it's in your favor, Jacob.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the church that we were going to that treated communion a bit more reverently, they also did it every week. And so, which makes sense with the more liturgical structure, that they would have that every week. So, yeah.
Yeah. Because traditionally, the apostolic churches, so-called Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, so-called, sure, yeah, the acclaimed, right? I think we are as well, but it's fine. I just use that as, like, the more, and as well. No. They I'm not sure about the Presbyterians. I actually haven't done much research into how often they do these kinds of things. It might vary based off the church, but but Lutheran, Episcopalian, Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox, like, especially Catholic and Orthodox, like, it is taken for granted that you are going to have the communion table every week, and Catholic and Orthodox, it's it's like as often as there is any gathering. There, like you, weddings, funerals. During, I believe, weddings and funerals. I could be wrong on that, but I'm fairly certain during both. And then also, any time during the week that a mass is offered, you can go in for communion. So it's like very regular that because again, the Eucharist is like the high point of the service. It's why people come. It's to receive the body and blood. And so I think that it makes sense in the other traditions. It's harder to come up with reasoning for why we should do it, because it's just a symbol for us, right? So now I'm curious though. For Eric,
I'll get into that. What's
your beef?
I'll get into the beef in a second. I have a few thoughts on what you just said though, because like I think there's like something interesting about the way things in Protestant / evangelical type culture has developed in history, in the way that the Lord's table is approached. Because like at the time of the Reformation, like the whole beef, aside from like the theological matter of what was happening with the Lord's Supper, is that Rome was doing it, not that they were just like theologically wrong about the contents of the supper, but they were just doing it wrong. Like they weren't giving people the cup, if I'm mistaken.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Well, I know I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I know I'm not mistaken.
No, you're right. You're right. They weren't.
But like the point being is like that really ticked off the reformers, you know, and they really wanted to.
Yeah.
That spurred their conversation of not only like the mode by which we perform or give the Lord's Supper to the laity, but also it got them talking about the what's the word I'm looking for? Like how often, the repetition by which we're supposed to the frequency.
Yeah, the frequency
by which we're supposed to take it. And most people, like most of the reformers, to my knowledge, are saying like we got to take this like weekly. This has been withheld from us. This has been kept from us. And so that was the attitude, in my understanding, of the reformers at the time of the Reformation and forwards. And so now here we are, you know, of 500 plus years later, and we have in America ultimate freedom to be able to organize our liturgical systems in any way. And those churches which are more low church have almost like reverted back to like a less, not that they're not like withholding the cup. I doubt most people would do something like that.
Yeah,
but in terms of frequency, it's almost like it's been dialed back again in my, like the way I'm understanding it, and that's just so odd to me, because that's so like against what the reformers themselves like were fighting for, were arguing against. And then it's we can get into my beef, I guess, in a second here if you want to, but it's just it's so strange to me, because like the reformers like had such a stress of importance on the Lord's Supper and the ability for the laity to take it, and like it's gone away from that, especially in the more low church type settings. I would say I'm not sure I can make that charge against some of the higher liturgical systems, like the ones that you mentioned. I'm not going to list them all again, but definitely in the lower church ones, it's interesting to me. Yeah. Oh, I was also going to say, just real quickly too, that, and I think it just slipped out of my head. Whoops. That's okay. Go ahead, Jacob. Yeah.
Well, so one thing that's kind of fascinating, and maybe this is like a counterbalancing act. I have a buddy who basically told me at one point. He said, the modern day low church Baptists, low church Protestants in general, have reverted back to the priesthood. And the reason they said that is because there's a pastor who gets up and basically spends 50 minutes or an hour or 45 minutes or whatever it is teaching a congregation, and that actually is almost the entirety of the impetus for going to church, to the degree that you could actually broadcast that online and consider that church, right? So that's how disembodied and unequally the parts to play are in the church. The pastor does his thing. Arguably, there's some worship, but you could easily just play some worship music over it and probably get the same effect, right? But most of what you're there for, like, people will, like, you know, and I even do this, and this is probably wrong, but there are times where, like, I'll be having a conversation with someone out in the lobby, and I'll realize the music has started, and I'll say, okay, that means I have 15 minutes before church starts. It's like, no. What are you doing there, right? Like, you're saying that the sermon is actually the meat of church, and that's what we're here for, right? So my buddy says that we've gone back to a priesthood where the scriptures are actually inaccessible to people. People will not read their Bibles unless they think that they know what their pastor would say about the scriptures. Yeah. They let their pastor become the priest that interprets the scriptures for them. And communion is like one of the only elements in church that actually, like, makes everybody equal for a second, because everyone is brothers at the same table. We're all coming together to share in the same meal and recognize our equal need for Jesus's body and blood, right? And the fact that these very low church, and very honestly, like, driven by a desire to eradicate hierarchy churches, right? Like, the fact that we have put this one person in charge of the entire service and have taken away most of our practice, or the common practice, the frequent practice of communion, is just ironic to me. It's like, maybe that says something about the natural need to balance, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, you can't eliminate hierarchy. It'll be there in some form or fashion, no matter what. And that's kind of funny that low church type people, it's
insidious.
Will react. I understand the historical background and reacting to it and everything, but that is funny. I remembered what I was going to say. It was speaking to the frequency of taking it. I think this is probably similar to what you would say, Jacob, as far as like the pragmatic reasoning behind why it should be weekly. This is kind of the argument I would give, if need be, is and it has to do, I guess, frequency is going to get tied up with your theological view of like what's going on in the supper as well. And so I guess I'll kind of spill my type of view, and then why I think weekly is probably for best. Is I kind of I'm pretty much synonymous, I think, with Calvin's view of the supper. I take the spiritual presence type of view, being that Christ his body and his blood is spiritually present within the elements as you partake of them, so that when you partake of the elements, you're being united with Christ. I would even agree with Calvin when he says that we are spiritually feasting and drinking Christ's body and blood as we partake of the elements. With a very heavy emphasis upon union with Christ, and I think his followers and the Reformed tradition draw mostly from 1 Corinthians 10 to get that, probably a bit from John 6, depending upon if you take that passage to be a reference to the Lord's Supper at all, which I'm not really sure hard, still. Right? But anyways, that kind of summarizes my views. So that in mind, what's happening there is, in some sense, the Lord's Supper is a grace to people and something spiritually you are benefiting from when you're partaking of the elements. And so we can flesh that out a bit more if you'd like, as to like what that means, at least my understanding at the moment of what that means. But nevertheless, if you're benefiting in some way from partaking of the elements, why would you withhold those benefits from people, is the question.
Right.
Why would you withhold union with Christ from people, is the question. So I don't know that there's a good answer to that. I mean, I think what most low church type people, what they're trying to do is preserve some element of reverence for the table, at least in the best light for people. They're trying to get people to like desire partaking of the Lord's Supper together, like, and they think that by withholding that, it's a more special type occasion, a more special event.
Which makes sense if you just think it's a memory, right? Because it's like a birthday. You don't want to celebrate your birthday every week, but you got it once a year. It's a big special thing. It's more special if you do it that way, right?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of where my beef comes in, I suppose. Is
Eric's beef.
The mere symbolic type view. Which, ironically, like, most people tie that symbolic type view back to Zwingli, but as I've, like, read Zwingli and some different scholars on Zwingli, I've read a very minimal amount, but nevertheless, like, I think people in low church Protestantism today, like, go past even what Zwingli would say about the Lord's Supper. Like, because Zwingli, it's not clear to me that, like, he takes, like, a mere symbolic type view. He has elements of what Calvin says about the Lord's Supper in it. He just kind of stops a bit short in some of the language that Calvin and other Reformed type people will say about it. Like, he stops a little bit short, and he wouldn't say something like spiritual presence or...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's my understanding Zwingli takes a heavy emphasis upon the body of Christ being united together in the Lord's Supper, but that's about it. I think that's about as far as he goes. So, like, in
my view,
I think so Calvin, he says that, but he takes that step further and kind of gives a little bit more explanation as to what the believer is receiving in the elements. I think he writes about that in one of his short catechisms. I'm forgetting which one it is. But anyways, that's kind of where I'm at. That's why I would probably caution against not doing it weekly. Because I don't find it to be merely symbolic. So, yeah.
Right.
Well, that's kind of interesting too, because I feel like, I think it shows, or maybe we can talk about or tie this back into how churches set up their service even to begin with. Because when I was studying, what is it? I can't remember the word. Sorry. But I remember that you can set up your church service to be, or the end goal of your church service is like a couple different things. I think they broke it down into 3, and one of them is like an experience. Like throughout the service, you're trying to create an experience for people, and that is shown in the worship. Like you're trying to build up this great experience for people of worshiping, and the sermon builds into like an experience or an emotional response, and then communion is also an experience, something that you do, and so that I think churches can build out the sermon or build out the Sunday service in a way so that everything becomes an experience, which might be good, might be not.
Yeah, it depends on your philosophy, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's a good question to ask, though. Like, what is it that in our church services we are ushering people towards? What are we accentuating? What are we emphasizing? What's the end goal, right? And to a degree, like, here my Reformed side's going to come out and say, well, it doesn't really matter because God will do something there that may be very different than what you planned on him doing there. But
are you okay with that?
I do think that it matters. Yeah. Certainly we have to be okay with that. If we're not, that's foolish. But I think there is, like, I think it's probably worthwhile because I think it tells us what we think is actually important in all of this, right? Like, and maybe having clarity on that would be would be helpful. Like, what do I think church ends with, right? What do I think the purpose of gathering is?
Right.
And,
well, to bring it back to communion, like we at the church that I worked at, when we did communion there, we set up the communion, like a big bowl of all the communicables at the entrances, and people would grab their communion and hold it until a part of the service.
Oh, that's interesting.
oh wow,
So yeah, they wouldn't even
I
pass
like
it
that.
out, you know. And I think that was a rebound from like COVID-esque, like
yeah.
like touching or passing the plate. Essentially, it's like don't spread
Right.
the germs. But yeah, we would pick it up and hold it, which is also interesting because it's like, that's interesting because if you make it available to everybody, then you would assume that people would take it when they feel it necessary to, or when they feel it appropriate to, is probably a better way to say
Right.
it, rather than a church withholding communion and then passing it out and saying, this is the time that we take it. And in that way, that's kind of like making an experience, because it's like, this is when it's going to happen now, you know?
Yeah, yeah. In our youth group, we made the decision early on when we would do communion, which for a while was like weekly. Communion was a part of our weekly gatherings, even as a youth group. And we're rethinking whether we should, maybe for a number of reasons, why we should, or maybe like move it to a different gathering, just so that there's like maybe some more distinction, because youth group is also kind of an evangelistic effort, and having communion presupposes that the people know what communion is and are in a good place to receive it. But we did this thing, I can never remember if it's intincture or intinction. I think it's intinction. But the idea of, you've probably done this before at some point, where you take a chunk of bread off of an actual loaf of bread and you dip it in the juice, not wine, obviously. We're not going to go all the way with children. Everybody's getting wasted at youth group. They would dip it in the cup, and they take it back with them, and kind of like the juice is running off your hand, and it's like this very like visceral experience every time. And I just love that, because I think it creates an environment that's maybe a little bit more outside your comfort zone, a little more vulnerable, right, and very sensual, right? Like obviously not in the erotic way, but like, engaging your senses in a way that a lot of things in church nowadays don't. So we did that for probably like close to a year straight, every week. It was awesome.
Yeah.
I'll share my view on it right now. I'm a little destabilized in my view right now. I would say I lean towards a memorialist perspective, meaning that communion is just remembering. And I know that that's probably not what Eric wants to hear, but that's okay.
Everybody's somewhere.
We can still be brothers in Christ.
Does that tie into like the symbolic idea? Or
Yeah,
symbolic
memorialist and symbolic are the same.
Okay.
Usually.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Now, the one thing I that's been destabilizing for me is reading in 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul says, is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? And I think, so for me, I've like looked into the Greek of that
I was just about to do
phrase.
that.
The word, so the word for participation is actually the good Christian Greek word that everybody knows, koinonia. It's the same. It's the fellowship in the blood, and fellowship in the in the body. I don't even have the slightest clue of how to interpret that. Like, I don't know what Paul had in mind when he wrote those words, and this is part of where like the gap in language comes. So I think it might be appropriate, and this is probably where I'll land for a while, just to say I think communion is the participation It's the koinonia in the blood and body of Christ. And I don't know what that means. And maybe that is just memorialist, and maybe there is something going on behind the scenes. I think I'm willing to allow for some mystery. I know that I've had friends who have had very ecstatic experiences when they're at the table, and who have, like, you know, like, there have been, like, visions, and I know that there have been people who have walked into churches that I know, that, like, their first time in church, and they took communion, and that was actually the moment that they felt like the communion with Christ was born in them, like, where they felt like they first believed is actually at the table. So there's a power behind communion that I don't quite understand. It seems to not entirely be like just a, you know, just a symbol, right? But I also don't want to get into the thing that I fear in all of my addresses of communion is that we begin to treat the elements as if they are sacred in a way that is like almost like a talisman, or like a, you know, like superstitious, right? So there's in a high church environments, if you drop the host or the bread on the ground, if you drop the blood, like, there's a whole regiment for how that has to be addressed. In the Catholic Church, they put the wafer on your tongue because they need to know that you're not going to go and, like, take the host out back and, you know, like, bury it in the ground or go and, you know, like, desecrate it in some way. Like, they need to make sure that you're actually taking it. And I think that gets away from the heart of communion, which is not, like, this kind of superstitious, right? Like, you know, like, I don't think that the bread itself or the wine itself or the cup itself has any genuine power, even if it is being used for communion. I think it's something about the environment of the believer taking communion and what the believer believes the communion to be that invites the atmosphere of transformation. But anyhow, I'm let's just say I'm a little destabilized. I also think, and this is maybe my hot take, and I don't know what to do with this yet, but it seems to me, based off 1 Corinthians 11, the next chapter, that whatever is happening in that early church environment with the bread and the cup, it was a meal. Like, this was not I'm going to take a crumb of a cracker and I'm going to take a tiny
Which is
sip
why
of
I'm
juice.
not
Like,
a fan
this
of
seems
the
to be
cracker and cups.
No, me neither. Yeah. Like, I think that we've so like, you know, the whole impetus in 1 Corinthians 11, which is so funny, is that people were going to communion with each other and eating it and drinking at the table in order to, like, get their daily meal and, like, get drunk. Like, they're coming and they're eating all the food and they're drinking all the wine, and that's why Paul is so ticked off at them, is he's like, you guys, this is not just about you. Like, there are poor people among you that are going hungry because of this. Like, eat at home. My gosh. But that rebuke and, like, the thing that he says after, like, some of you have eaten improperly and have fallen asleep because of it, right? That, like, that whole thing only makes sense in light of it being a meal. And what we've done is we've, like, so separated it from its context that we've actually had to come up with different rules in order to make sense of, like, the whole. So I'm sure you guys have heard this before, of, like, when you come to communion and your pastor says something like, make sure that your heart is pure before God before you eat and drink, right? And it's like, that's not even close to what Paul was talking about here. Like, it's not about, like, some vague sins that you have to come and confess. It was about these dudes that were coming in and eating all the food and, like, being greedy with the food and drinking all the wine and like, you know, making a mockery of the table. Like, that was the whole point. And so I think that, like, the fact that we have created that we've separated from communion the feasting element of it, I think that's actually made it, like, impossible for us to imagine the context. Like, we've so separated the context that we've actually had to come up with our own rules about how we do communion to try to somehow piece together how this connects back to what Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians 11. and I think that's not good. So I don't know whether that means we should be doing a meal, like a full-on meal, or just something closer to a meal, but I do think that's what
starting with bread and wine would be great.
yeah, real bread, real wine.
Well, I think that another interesting thing, as you were saying that, Paul was so angry because these people are eating and drinking everything, and some people might not get to participate. Well, can we even empathize with that situation? I mean,
no,
we live
that's
in
the
a
problem.
Culture of such, like, vast.
Oh yeah,
wealth, and
yeah.
We do not live in a scarce culture at all. It's like,
no,
like we have this wine, and we're trying to make this work for everybody here who wants to take, but you are all stealing it essentially.
Yes,
it's like,
yes.
Churches have gallons of grape juice in the communicables, that they stock up.
Yeah.
They have a surplus,
Yeah.
And also, we don't go hungry. Obviously, there are people in America that go hungry all the time, but the vast majority of us live in this culture of surplus, to where, I mean, would we even know a fulfilling meal, like if it actually hit us,
Yeah.
like a meal that, and that's part of what I think communion is supposed to represent, is like this meal that not only fulfills your body's desire for food and for nourishment, but also it satisfies your spiritual need for healing and for a savior, essentially.
Yeah.
And people were so aware of their lack, or they were aware of their need, and now we're not so aware of our need as a people, because we have everything we need,
Right. Yeah, and I think even beyond that, like, I wonder, like, I think whoever had to be providing the meal, whether it was like the church leadership or it would rotate based off of whose house they were holding it in, or I don't know how it worked, right? But whoever had to pick up that meal had to remember the position of their brothers and sisters who were coming to the meal. They had to remember, they had to have a heart and compassion for the people that were coming to the table that week with them. And I think that there's something missing in that too, where it becomes this kind of sterilized, transactional, oh yeah, this is the part where we do this little thing with a plastic cup, right? Like, it becomes this very disembodied, very I don't know, like, I would say unloving, in the sense that there's nobody that's being loved in it, right? There's nobody that's, nobody's picking up a meal for the 3 people in their church who are homeless, or who can't, have trouble making it day to day, not sure where their next meal is coming from. There's no heart of compassion in the way that we do communion nowadays. We just do it. We have the privilege for it to be merely symbol. You know what I mean? Like, in the early church, it seems like it couldn't have been just symbol. It had to also be a functional, pragmatic meal for those who came.
Right.
So,
right. It was a ministry in and of itself, because
it was a ministry. Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's perfect, Nate. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyhow, that's kind of some of my gripes with the way that we do communion.
I feel like we could keep talking about this, and this is actually a really interesting conversation, because I think it bleeds into so many other conversations about church and maybe how we should operate as church. But one question that I want to finish with, maybe we can wrap it up with this question, is like, who can administer communion?
Oh, administer. Oh, that's an interesting.
So because if we're talking about communion as a meal shared with brothers and sisters, that gets really hard, or logistically that gets hard in big churches nowadays. Because that's a lot of food every single week, and where are people going to eat it? And that creates opportunities for people to just like create their little groups and cliques and whatever else.
Right.
Like, should it be done in life groups? Like, who can administer it there? Should it be done in homes, or what does that look like? You know, maybe in a home and you invite several other families with you, or you invite your coworkers or whatever. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in what we would call life groups now, or what I think the early church would have called a church. Like, I think that the whole notion of gathering together in groups of hundreds of people, it creates like a very concert-like experience, and I think that's fine, and I think it's actually good in some ways for the unification of all those little churches, right? But I think that if somebody's going to church every week and they're listening to a sermon and then they don't have any fellowship outside of that, I don't think they're participating in church. I think you need to be in communion with other people in a deep and authentic way. And I think the best way to do that is what we would call life groups or small groups or groups or whatever else. So yeah, I would say, man, if you have a budget and the ability to do a meal each week, with, you know, even if you have to rotate around who's doing it, right? It shouldn't cost more than just feeding yourself that day. If you're dividing it evenly among everybody, right? If you're able to do that, I think that is a powerful way of uniting people. I'll try not to take too much time here, but I think there's a gal in my church who used to be a missionary, and she lived in China for a while, and I remember asking her, like, what's one of the things in all your traveling and all your time overseas that you felt like what's the one way that they do church differently there that I think like maybe we're missing out on? And she said they cook together, and we don't do that here.
Yeah.
And the power of eating and cooking together, and that has been like kind of mulling in my mind for a while, and I think that's a really important aspect of gathering. So yeah, no, I would say who administers it is whoever has the heart of compassion to administer it, right? If you're thinking about it in terms of a meal. If you're thinking about it in terms of like a liturgical symbol, then I would say probably the eldership team, because to some degree the Lord's table has become a way of, like, I hate to say this, but almost gatekeeping. Like, it's like, who's actually fit to take communion? And so if somebody is barred from communion, that's a way of acknowledging before the church, like, this person has some stuff they need to sort out before they're of a good place to come back and join us in this. They're not in fellowship with us right now.
We should talk about that because I remember a couple months ago the Pope barred, or bishop here, not the Pope, sorry, but a bishop here in the States barred a politician.
Nancy Pelosi?
Yeah.
Yeah, because she
Yeah.
a full-blown abortionist. That's why.
Right, because
somehow Joe
abortion,
Biden's not barred. We won't talk about that.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, but that's really interesting as well, like, as we're talking about communion, you know, and somebody being barred from it. But anyway, sorry.
We should just talk about church discipline at some point, because I think that's another really interesting
topic. Talking about the church. I love talking about how we should worship. I love talking about services. I love talking about the
I honestly
church,
feel like we should do
maybe
a part 2 of this, because I still have a lot to say. Like, I don't even feel like I've said a quarter.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for taking up. I feel like I've taken a lot of.
Yeah, no. I know we're kind of on a timetable. Sorry, everybody. Yeah. I'm going to my movie, but it's my birthday movie, so.
to be super brief on my view on that, I would say I think the administration of the elements of the Lord's Supper should be left to the clergy, or the eldership, as Jacob put it, with a few exceptions. If there's some tribe in Africa that gets the internet and repents of their sins and follows Christ, I'm serious, and somehow gets a hold of.
I just thought it was funny. That gets internet part.
Yeah.
That's very funny.
But gets a hold of Scripture and truly like in their heart of hearts, like repent and follow Christ, like, and they wish to honor God's word and partake of the sacraments together. I think far be it from me to say that, you know, because they didn't have an ordained clergyman there, that their elements are
right, that they didn't really participate in communion.
Right. Or, and this gets into church hierarchy stuff, or like ecclesiology, but why don't they just ordain somebody?
We could perhaps get into that too. Yeah. That's fair enough. But anyways, so scripturally speaking, like even in those two passages, 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 are like so critical to me in my view of the Lord's Supper. So,
as they should be.
And you know, Paul's warning that those who are eating and drinking unworthily are drinking judgment upon their head. Like, I have a hard time seeing Paul like just being okay with any lay member just going about and using the elements in that sort of way with a judgment like that attached to it. I suppose that would seem very hazardous to me. That people
there's something to dive into there.
There's caution,
and that judgment too there is another big reason why I take the spiritual presence views, because if you're literally, as you're eating and drinking the elements, having judgment poured on you, something has to be happening with it.
Something metaphysically is happening.
That's kind of my reason why. So I know there's a lot more that could be said there. There's a lot more that could be said about this topic in general. I think we've only touched the very tippy top of the iceberg. But I think it should be left in the hands of the church leadership, with some exceptions possibly.
Yeah, man, guys, how do we make it this long without talking about communion? Our whole podcast is named the Triclinium, which is the table,
the logo
that we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Like that. How did we? You know,
it probably should have been our first.
That should have been our first episode. Let's go back. Let's rewrite the
you know what? Let's delete everything we've done.
We're starting over, guys. We're starting over.
This is now episode 1.
I'm not doing
Welcome
that.
to the start of the podcast.
Welcome to the Triclinium. Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode, guys. If you have any comments or topics that you'd like to suggest, or any questions based off of this episode, we'd love to hear from you at sophomorosofficial@gmail.com. That's SOPHOMOROS official@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and thanks for listening, like I said. And as always, may Christ be exalted.